בחודש הזה כי נבוא עזבי חויזה וישוע בית הזה כל סוסוין וכל שמחו בוזוק עם הלב נשאר לסהינו אמיץ יעשה בקוש עושינו והוא ישלם במעשה ידינו ולא חווה הצלחו והוא ישלם במעשה ידינו ולא חווה הצלחו.
Hello everyone. Now let's go one step further and ask ourselves, what's the status of this Kel Malay in general? So, the Beit Joseph says, Nirali, I think, that everything that you're not allowed to do in order to eulogize, say 30 days before Yontiv, you're not allowed to eulogize, all that is true when we're talking about eulogizing someone that's freshly, unfortunately, departed from this world. The fact that a year later, on the yard site, you go ahead and you have a little eulogy for the person that died, this is absolutely permissible, even 30 days before a Yontiv. Comes along the Beit Joseph and says, this is not to go ahead and make people cry like a fresh eulogy, but rather the opposite. It's to stop their avelus a year later. And therefore, says the Beit Joseph, it is absolutely okay to do even within 30 days before Yontif. From this perspective, that's what the Shulchan Aruch paskins lehalacha, that indeed, if it's a year later, and obviously years later, you could say a Kel Malay if it's more than a year later. The Beit Hillel that comes along and says that the Kel Malay that we say is no problem to say, obviously, within 30 days before Yontif. But more importantly, the reason is because we say it on Yontif, at Yisker. So all the more so it's okay. It's not considered a eulogy at all. This is not considered that we are eulogizing them, but rather, as he says, Kel Malay is to daven on their behalf, which is allowed on Yontif, before Yontif, and after Yontif, no problem. And many others agree with this opinion. Rav Moshe Feinstein, on the other hand, had a different perspective on this particular issue. He comes along and says, the general minhag is you don't say Kel Male Rachamim on days, you don't say Tachanun. And he basically says it is an absolute continuation of not saying Tziduk Adin, the long Tziduk Adin at a burial site, the long Kaddish at a burial site. In other words, he doesn't see Kel Male as just a prayer service, but rather he sees it as a eulogy. And therefore, just like you don't eulogize on days that you don't say Tachanun, you also don't say Kel Malay on days you don't say Tachanun. And if it falls out on Shabbos, then you don't say it on Shabbos. From this perspective, he really doesn't know why we don't say it on Shabbos Mevarchin, but he upholds the minhag and says we also don't say it then. And Rav Tikochinsky in Gesher HaChaim basically upholds the same idea and says En Omrim Askarat Neshamot, and in parentheses he says that means Kel Malay Rachamim, Rosh Chodesh Chanukah, Kol Chodesh Nisan, Me'isru Chag de Sukkos at Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, basically enumerating all the days you don't say Tachanun, you don't say Kel Malay. So in a word, the machloket between those that allow it and those that don't is going to be, how do you define Kel Malay? As the Beit Hillel said, and as the Mishnah Bura says succinctly, Af baregel atzmo mutar ve'ino hesped, ela shemitpalelim alein. This is not a eulogy, but rather it's a prayer on behalf of the dead. However, Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Tikochinsky seem to see it as a eulogy, lechol davar ve'inyan, for every sake and purpose. And therefore, just like eulogies are not allowed on days you don't say Tachanun, so too, you can't say Kel Malay on days you don't say Tachanun. At the end of the day, to allow it or not to allow it is going to be dependent upon how do you define Kel Malay Rachamim. Is it just a prayer on behalf of the dead? Or is it an actual eulogy on behalf of the dead? If it's a prayer, it would be allowed, and you have much more leeway even on days you don't say Tachanun. But if it's a eulogy, you'd have much less leeway. I remember